Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Wood. I'm the Director of Programs here at the Architecture Center. Thank you all for coming out to what is a new program for us. The Brilliance of American Architecture is the title of this year's program. I'll tell you a little bit about the program because, unfortunately, Lynn Osmond booked a trip, unfortunately, a few years ago, thinking she'd be a little exhausted after having created the Chicago Architecture Center, but she really wishes she could have been here because when she first became CEO many years ago, 23 years ago, she talked to a whole bunch of people who kept telling her about Vincent Scully. And Vincent Scully being the greatest master lecturer in architecture, certainly in the United States. So she had seen a few of these things and put down, I'm convinced she had about 4 or 5 ideas in her wallet after the first maybe 2 months of running this place. But she's very persistent, and it took her many, many years of talking to people saying that someday we should do something in honor of Vincent Scully. So fast forward to 2006. In 2006, Lynn had the good fortune of being in the same room as Reed Kroloff, who was fighting against another panelist, shouting and jumping up and down and carrying on. And she thought, I think I found my Vincent Scully. So that happened, and then about 12 years later, finally, the stars aligned, and we were in a campaign to create our new Center for Architecture. And so it all came to pass because Rich and Ann Carr, good friends of the Chicago Architecture Center, made a large campaign gift to make a 4-year commitment possible for this kind of program. This is meant to be a multi-part class. We do these a lot, lifelong learning programs. We don't necessarily always do them with this level of investment. And so one of the other reasons why this all works is because of Reed, and so it's my job to just say a quick word about Reed. Reed, many of you probably know because you're members. Reed has been a good friend of the Architecture Center for years, maybe forever, I think. Let's see, if you know Ned Kramer, who used to be a curator here, Ned is here because of Reed. Reed was once the editor-in-chief at Architecture magazine. Ned was here as a curator for a few years. He's now the editor-in-chief at Architect magazine. Reed helps us on all sorts of programs. He's helped us create programs, our Architect Talk series. He is our sort of host. Our exhibits, he advises all the time on exhibits. He advised on the making of the Architecture Center and everything in between. What you may not know about Reed is that he's done a little bit of everything. So he is certainly a noted architectural commentator. He's one of the few on the TED stage talking about architecture. And what really his gift is interpreting architecture for a public audience. And so there are a lot of things about Vincent Scully that he'll talk about. There are a lot of programs and a lot of memorials about Vincent Scully. To my mind, I believe this is the only one that's actually open to a public audience. So it's quite in keeping with sort of the spirit and times of the Chicago Architecture Center. Reed has done all sorts of public things, but he's done some private things. He was the immediate past director at Cranbrook Academy of Art and Art Museum. One of the great things at Cranbrook is that you're also the campus architect, which, if you've been there, is kind of big shoes to fill, but a pretty terrific job. And he did all sorts of updates to studio space at Cranbrook. He is responsible for the complete renovation of the Art Museum and a ground-up addition to the Art Museum. If you've never been to Cranbrook outside Detroit, that's something you're going to have to do this summer. It's an absolute must-see. Prior to that, though, he was the dean at the Tulane School of Architecture. Great job, he was having a terrific time, and then a little hurricane came along, and instead of him shrinking, he sprung into action, and in over a kind of a feverish 2-year period, he did all sorts of things for the city of New Orleans, but it started with Tulane. He boasted a 100% retention of the faculty at the School of Architecture and 85% retention of the students. Because of Reed and either his direct work or partnerships that he forged, over 100 new buildings are now in New Orleans, all from Reed. So he's absolutely good people. He's a terrific speaker. Class will start in just a minute. It's not exactly class. The bar will be open for a little while. It's a little bit like class because the bathrooms are about a mile away down the corridor and down the hall. But if you would, maybe a warm welcome for the next 3 nights, and thank you all for all the time you're investing in this. But let's welcome Reed to tell us about tonight and to get us going.
Thanks, Woody. All right, I'm going to stand up here because I have to, for all of you in the back. Welcome. Glad you're here. Woody, thank you for that really lovely introduction. My mother thanks you for that lovely introduction. Some of the things he said are true. How does this sound good? It sounds a little loud to me.
Yes.
Yeah? All right, Rob says yes, so we're good. This is an exciting thing for me, and particularly exciting thing for me. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors, as Woody did as well. This is a lovely thing to dedicate something to Vince Scully. I would not be standing here before you tonight if it weren't for Vince Scully. I was an undergraduate student at Yale, where he taught. In my second year, casting about, not doing particularly well, not knowing why I was there, not really enjoying it. Anybody been to New Haven? In New Haven in the early 80s. And my mother said to me, why don't you go take this class? There's this famous art historian there named Vincent Scully. And I'm like, okay. So I went and I took his first lecture, and I thought he was absolutely insane. So I dropped the class. I'd never heard of someone talk about architecture the way he was talking about it. Buildings don't lift and thrust and pull and push. They're inanimate objects and sit there, but not in Vincent Scully's world. They were not that. And so I dropped the class, as I said, and I came back a year later and tried to take it again. And I made it through the first lecture. And by the time I was through the second lecture, it was all over. I was going to be an architect. That was it. This man standing in front of that auditorium, that's a photograph of the room he lectured in without a break for 47 years on that stage, was a magic carpet ride into things that I just couldn't imagine were true about what makes architecture, what makes architects, why we should care about them, and how the world would change. And why was someone like this so important and so persuasive? Vincent Scully was born in 1920 in New Haven, Connecticut, a town he loved very much. He enrolled at Yale, and I'm holding this piece of paper just to see if I can get through this without looking. He enrolled at Yale in 1936. What year did I tell you he was born? How old is he? You can all be architects. That's good. That's the extent of the math you need. That's perfect. 16 years old, he enrolled at Yale. 2 years later, he went off to fight in World War II. So as an actual freshman-age person, came back in 1940, finished his undergraduate and graduate degrees in 4 years, and got a PhD. So he was a bit slow, but he persevered, and over time became one of the most distinguished scholars in architectural history. In fact, he helped build that as an area of scholarship in this country. It had a European tradition, but not nearly so strong here. And he did so in a way that caught the attention of many people. Yes, that is Time magazine, and that's Time magazine when it mattered. Back in the 1970s, I'm sorry, anybody here from that company. That's Vince right down there on the bottom in the middle. I don't know many architecture history professors that have made the cover of Time magazine, but I only had to know one. He became known originally for his scholarship in American architecture and styles in the vernacular that people might not have paid attention to before. How many of you have used the term shingle-style building? You got it from Vincent Scully. He was the one who coined the phrase and then wrote a book later on called The Shingle Style, and its successor, The Shingle Style Today. I couldn't find a photo of the shingle style itself, which talked about how that style carried from the late 19th century in the work of McKim, Mead, and White, that's the Low House at the top, and then later on shows up almost 100 years later in the work of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown in the Truebeck and Wislocky houses. And so that this is a tradition that is still modern and alive in Vince's scholarship, and still so today. He's a person who could talk about the power and the weightiness and the kind of heft of the work of somebody like Richardson, Henry Hobson. This is going to be good. This is going to be good, I can tell. Henry Hobson Richardson, and can could describe it as something, an inheritor of the Roman tradition, hence the term Romanesque, which we see in those arches, and then he would immediately connect it to Frank Lloyd Wright in Oak Park and the beautiful arched center of this house, which, of course, Wright was looking very carefully and directly at Richardson, but also at Sullivan, who had also looked at Richardson, and and Scully was fascinated with making these kinds of connections for young people like myself. And then moving that forward to the middle of the 20th century in the work of people like Lucan here at the famous Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, always running with Scully with this connection to history. So Scully saw Kahn as the inheritor of that same historic tradition that Wright and Sullivan and Richardson had been drawing on as well, with the imposing solidity and power of these buildings and their approach to the landscape and the view, and grabbing that piece of the Pacific Ocean as if they had always owned it.
That's an early photograph.
It's a very early photograph. That's right. That's almost brand new. He was also a noted scholar on urbanism as well. Not just buildings, but how they go together to make towns and places and cities. And so in this text, a seminal text, American Architecture and Urbanism, you can see him writing about things that other people would never have written about. Look closely at this photograph. Look at the building on the cover. Does that look like an important place? It isn't. I don't have any idea where it was, and I'm sure if you look it up, it just says small town somewhere. And that's what was important to him, was to look, among many other things, to look at the things that other people didn't see and try and make connections to our world with them. But he looked at big cities as well. Yeah, thank you. Daniel Burnham in right here in Chicago, Illinois. Didn't get built quite like that. That looks closer to Washington, D.C., but nevertheless, a strong comment about how the city could be, and of course, the birth of the city beautiful movement right here in Chicago. Scully didn't care if it was that or this, and yes, that is a real town in Tennessee, and yes, that is a real city hall. Heaven knows how it got built in that little town. But he was as interested in those as he was in the grandeur of a Burnham-style plan for Chicago. He was particularly interested in New Haven and its famous 9-square grid plan. So does everybody see the 9 squares? And Yale University was just up there on the center square in the top. Not the Paul Lind position in the middle, but the one right above it. And he was always fascinated with how this worked and how this grid inspired someone like Thomas Jefferson to see across, in his rationalist view of America, the entire American landscape as one gridded, endless expanse. But he was also very aware of the troubles and the changes that had come to cities, though he had been an ardent supporter of the modernists like Wright and Corbusier and Mies. When the modernist planners came into their own in the 1950s and 60s and began to remove entire sections of cities, including this one, New Haven, Connecticut, and his neighborhood, he became enraged, and he became a strong proponent for rethinking what we were doing to our cities, and one of the most vocal people in the movement to try and save this building, Pennsylvania Station, which, as you can see, was a strong political moment. You may recognize this guy right here. He has more hair in this picture than he ever would again. This is Philip Johnson as a relatively young man, only in his 50s. Next to him, come on, liberal political historians. Nope, that's Jane over here. Kennedy? Ethel Kennedy? Can anybody tell me who that guy is? Because I don't know. So, but there they are protesting the imminent demolition of Pennsylvania Station, which no one ever thought would happen. A building that was just the laciest and most beautiful representation of things. There's a seat up front if you need one, of things that we could do in architecture. Something that was of great public beauty, a place where people gathered until they didn't. And this is exactly what happened to it. And Scully has a famous quote of describing Pennsylvania Station as something, the place in the city that we came in like kings, and now perhaps it was too great, and we enter the city like rats in a cage. And that's the cage that replaced it. So very outspoken, he continued to promote architecture that he believed was sensitive to human needs, and was the editor and the person who pushed the Museum of Modern Art to publish this important book, Robert Venturi's Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture. He was actually the editor of the book and wrote the introduction. So it was critical for him in the early 1960s to get on the bandwagon of what eventually became known as postmodernism. The movement came to be known as postmodernism, not a title he gave it, but one that led to something that we will see in a moment, an appreciation for history that modern architecture really hadn't been willing to entertain. And it shows up in, and I'll tell you why we're coming here. It shows up in this place. Does anybody know this? Seaside, exactly, in Florida. We're going to see it again in a moment. But it's important because Vince was the professor who taught two young architects, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberk, who ultimately went on to do Seaside. And I think it's kind of appropriate that he ended up here at the end. This is the Vincent Scully Memorial on the side of one of the buildings at Seaside. So if you like Seaside, good place to be. If you don't like Seaside, he's there forever. And that's one of his book covers painted on the building behind him. So Vince was an extraordinary character, a fantastic and dynamic lecturer, a man who very famously always used a long pointer to point at things on the screen, which he would hit with such velocity that more than once he literally ripped the screen off the wall. A man who, during a talk, was so excited about something that he leapt off the stage, fell down, cracked his head open, and got up, bleeding from the head, and finished the lecture. And I saw him do this, not that. I saw him speak like this, and I thought to myself, I want to do that. I want to be able to stand in front of an audience and make them laugh, or better yet, make them cry, which Scully was able to do. Over and over again at the drop of a hat. So, and it was only because he was a true scholar, a gifted speaker, and a passionate supporter of architecture. So I'm delighted that we have this, this celebration of Vince Scully. It's preposterous to put me on the same level of that, because I am not that kind of scholar, but it's a tremendous compliment to know that that you're able to follow the person that made you an architect. The person who's really unhappy about this is my mother, who told me to take this class, but did not like the idea of her child being an architect. And so after I took the class and went home at the holidays, and I sat my parents down and I told them, I've got something really important to say to you. There's something about me that I need to tell you. And it's different. It's a way that I am different from many other people, and that I like things that other people don't like. And they were looking at me like this, and I said to them, I think I might be architectural. And my mother just burst into tears and ran from the room. She wanted to know how she had failed as a parent, what she had left off. And here I am. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about architecture. And the talk is not about any particular subject other than what we talk about when we talk about architecture. How many of you are Raymond Carver readers? Okay, well, I'm really sorry. I apologize. So I stole this title from him, What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. If you haven't read that book, it's fantastic. Go back, go find it. But tonight, we're going to borrow it, and I did apologize in public to him, so all of you videotapers, get that down. So we're going to talk about what we talk about when we talk about architecture. And what we talk about when we talk about architecture is people. We talk about people. And it works like this. Who's this? Think hard. This man changed your life. You may not know it, but he changed your life, and yours, and yours. Anybody want to guess? Burnham? No, wrong, but it's a good guess. Burnham didn't really change, well, he changed Chicago's life, yes. This man changed everybody's lives. Carnegie, you're getting warm. This man's first initials are F and W. F.W. Woolworth. I didn't see where it came from. This was Franklin W. Woolworth. Do you see that those are piercing blue eyes? You can tell in black and white photography if they're blue or green because they're not brown, right? So this is Franklin Woolworth, who invented what? Woolworths. He invented the 5 and dime. He invented what was called the 5 and dime. What's a 5 and dime? He invented Walmart before there was Walmart, long before, 100 years before there was Walmart, although Walmart was founded as a 5 and dime to compete with Woolworth. Woolworth revolutionized retail. No one had ever thought of the idea of bringing inexpensive merchandise together in a large store and driving down prices by selling at high volumes. This was a dramatic change in the retail landscape of America, and it made him fantastically wealthy almost immediately. And what did you do when you were wealthy in America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? You built a building. You built yourself a high-rise. And so Franklin Woolworth, who lived outside of New York and then eventually in New York, built himself the tallest building in the world. In 1913, he erected this building, a Cass Gilbert fantasy of neo-Gothic extravaganza, 792 feet tall. 792 feet tall, the tallest thing in New York for 20 years, almost. For 20 years, this was the tallest building in New York. And what was New York? New York was the center of the world. This was the newest, most exciting city. By 1930, there were 10 million people in this city. And for the first time in almost 500 years, there was a city on the planet bigger than London. Now, think about that. In generations and generations, London had been the biggest city in the world. New York hadn't even been founded when London was already the biggest city in the world for 300 or 400 years. And then this one surpasses it like that. So by the time Franklin Woolworth is there, this city is the center of everything. And that building right in the center, does anybody know what that is? The Singer Tower. What is the Singer Tower? What did they do? Is it for people who sing? Oh, no, it was for people with sewing machines, exactly. So this was the age of merchandising fortunes and the people who made them presenting themselves to the world through tall buildings. Now, this is a picture of New York City at the same time. What are you looking at on the right-hand side there? That's not the High Line, but it is an elevated railway. That was what we would now call the subway, because they eventually went underground. What New York was this incredible, bustling metropolis, climbing higher and higher, full of all these people, always in motion, always going somewhere, always doing something, energy like you couldn't believe, and this pile-up of buildings down at the bottom. In a world where the tallest buildings in Europe were just barely 200 feet high, and those were the Gothic cathedrals, like Notre Dame that burned yesterday in Paris, terrible thing. Not as bad as it could have been, it turns out. But these are buildings that were 2 and 3 times the size of those buildings, and Woolworth built something almost twice as high as his nearest competitor. This is a huge accomplishment. And for 15 years, from 1916 to 1929, this building towered over the entire New York City. But not forever. This young man was an up-and-coming architect. This young man and his partner, this is a man named William Van Allen. And look at those glasses. You know that's an architect before he even starts. And look at him clutching that beautiful piece of polished stainless steel. Only architects love steel. Only architects hold on to steel like it's a lover. I mean, that no one else can get that close to a building material and feel excited in the loins by it, but architects can, right? And so here he is clutching it, looking out at his future, looking out over New York City, and his partner named Severance. He and Mr. Severance and Mr. Van Allen were popular architects around New York City, doing buildings that were very different. Notice the corner of this building? No structure in the corner of that building, just glass. They were structurally daring. They were modern, and yet that building's not quite modern, is it? Look at the parapet at the top. There's still just enough detail there to make you comfortable if you're a classical artist or a classical believer or someone for whom you want to tie to history. And at the same time, New York is growing, and Van Allen and his partner are interested in taking advantage of everything they can to try and build their firm and build their reputations. And so they help a developer acquire a piece of land right here. Now, where is here? Yeah, someone just said it. I don't know if I have a red device. I don't. Right up there. Does everybody recognize Grand Central hiding between the buildings there? So that neighborhood, Grand Central, is going up in the very beginning of the 20th century. Park Avenue, which is running up behind it, you can see the two streets. Look just to the left of Park Avenue. Do you see that it's a crisscross of railroad tracks running underneath there? All of that is fake. So Park Avenue is just a deck that runs all the way up into 72nd Street before it actually gets back onto solid ground. Right? So this was brand new development that had literally, like Chicago, been built above the ground out of nothing. And they were building as high and as fast as they could. And this architect got in bed with a developer to build a 70-story building. He was going to take Woolworth's building and go 200 feet higher. But the developer went out of business. And that was a shame for that architect. But he found somebody else. Who's this? Walter Chrysler. Good. Wow. Were you at the talk last week? This is Walter Chrysler. How many remember that name? Okay. How many of you actually know something about Walter Chrysler? So Walter Chrysler was born in 1875 in the middle of nowhere, Kansas. And in Kansas, he was in a small town. But the small town that he lived in, and Kansas was a state full of small towns at that time, the small town that he lived in was very much involved in the railroad industry. They built locomotives in his little town. And Walter Chrysler, by the time he was a teenager, was a journeyman engineer, railroad engineer. And his job was to help build the engines, the trains and their engines. And he worked in the machine shops, and he traveled across the country, all across the country, working with the railroads. And he got very, very good at managing the assembly production of trains. And he took that knowledge in 1911 when he was hired by a man who had started a little company called General Motors. But at the time, General Motors was nothing. It was a very small company. It had divisions, one of which was called Buick. And he was hired away from his job in the railroad industry where he was earning a lot of money. He was earning, in today's money, he was earning $70,000 a year. Which was a good salary then in the early 1900s. And they offered him $125,000 a year to come help run the body shops at Buick, because he was a good manager and he knew how to make the systems work better than they had worked before. So he took the job. He took the job in 1913 and went and worked for Buick and was fantastic. And by 3 years later, General Motors, which was having a lot of financial trouble, was terrified that they were going to lose him. So they took his $125,000, the president of General Motors, and said, I will pay you, if you stay, $250,000 a month. If you will stay and help me run Buick. Not only that, I will give you a bonus every year you stay of $500,000 in stock. And he said, of course I'll stay. Why would I not stay? And he did. But 3 years later, he'd gotten bitten by the bug because he understood that it was him that was running this company now and that he could actually run it as well as them. So he cashed in his General Motors stock for $10 million. Now, 3 years earlier, he'd been earning $75,000, and he had nothing. He took $10 million and what he had earned in his salary, and he left, and he went to work for another company called the Willis Overland Company. Willis Overland Company is now called Jeep. And at the time, they were going bankrupt. And so for $1 million a month, he took over that company. And 2 years later left and started his own company, Chrysler. That's all in 5 years, I want you to remember. 5 years. Vincent Scully got a PhD. This man made millions and millions and millions of dollars and started his own company. And Chrysler was an almost immediate success. Within 2 years of buying it, he had bought 2 other car companies, including the Dodge brothers, to build an extraordinary company in the early 1920s, a company that built cars based on their performance. These were fast cars. These were big cars. Look at the size of that car. They were enormous, and they were known for having the biggest engines you could get in an American car that could propel them to 0 to 60 and 70 and other crazy speeds, miles per hour, and much faster than anybody else's. And they were beautiful. He hired the very, very best stylists. Look at those white wall tires. That is a car wearing spats. This is a car that is dressed up and has somewhere to go. And Walter Chrysler made sure that Americans saw that his cars were the talk of the whole smart world. Smart meaning well-dressed and well-heeled, not intelligent necessarily. And you could buy one for $715. In today's money, that's still pretty expensive. They were expensive cars, but look at the women that are buying them. You can be the kind of dowdy old lady on the left or the stylish lady in the middle. Notice there's a lot of ladies that are buying cars because that was a market that was new and emerging. And Chrysler was a business person, and he was going to make sure he took advantage of it all. It landed him very quickly on the cover of Time magazine as a relatively young man and as someone on the go. Well, it turns out that he wanted to build a building in New York. And Mr. Van Allen, called Chrysler and said, "Have I got a deal for you?" and introduced him to this piece of property and the building that he was going to build there initially. And at about the same time, his partner, Mr. Severance, made good on his name and left and started working for another company in downtown New York, a banking company, and announced that they were going to build the tallest building in the world. Well, Chrysler, of course, was not going to have some pack of bankers run him out of town. So immediately, the Chrysler building was going to become the tallest building in the world. And starting in September 1928, these 2 buildings raced upwards across Manhattan. So here was the first sketches of the building downtown, right? And that's actually William Severance's signature there on, not William, sorry, I forgot Severance's first name. That's his signature on the bottom of that drawing. Now, remember, he had been Chrysler's partner. Look carefully at that building. Look carefully at its size. Look at how it steps back. Look at the tower. And here's Chrysler's first drawings of his buildings that they released to the public. Look similar? It's because Severance just stole the drawings and did them on his own. And Chrysler announced that his building would be one of these 3 things. And it would be 925 feet tall, 200 feet taller than Woolworth. Well, of course, the people downtown, their building was going to be suddenly 926 feet tall. They were going to have the tallest building, so up they go. And this is Chrysler under construction. And this is what became known as the Manhattan Bank building under construction. Well, Chrysler and Van Allen had other plans for this. Every week, it seemed, that there was a new announcement in the paper about which one of these buildings was going to be taller and go faster. And they were built, by the way, both in 13 months, right? So this was a fast competition. So at one time, they are building more than 1 floor a day on these buildings. Chrysler's building is going to be a monument to everything that is in his system. It's going to be a monument to machine-made gorgeousness, to the elegance of the materials that make up automobiles, and also to the Art Deco extravagance of the Jazz era that is starting all around them in New York and in which they are building. And his building is going to get taller and taller with this fantastic top that literally looks as if it's going to reach up and just dissipate into the sky because it's coated in aluminum. And so when the sun hits it, it just becomes this sparkling magic moment where you can barely see the top. It's so reflective. Oops, one too fast. So, what happens? The people in New York get ahead. They actually move ahead. And they're building faster than the Chrysler building. This is a good thing, says Walter Chrysler. And he comes to his architect and he says, God damn it, these people are not going to be taller than us. What are we going to do about it? And they come up with a scheme, which they do not announce, of course. They wait for the people at Manhattan Bank to make the announcement of the day they're going to finish their building. Stupid. Never tell your enemy what you're going to do if you don't know what they're going to do next. So secretly, Walter Chrysler and William Van Allen cooked up the top of the Chrysler building. And inside all of that stainless steel extravaganza, they assembled the spire in the building. They lifted it up in pieces along the side of the building so no one could tell what it was, and then bolted them all together inside the tower before they actually finished all the tower floors. So they had that empty space at the top. And then, and we're taking a little poetic license, then, on the day that the people in the Bank of New York were going to have their grand opening, Walter Chrysler borrowed from his friends in the theater business, because he was also a Broadway producer, lots and lots of theater lights. And on the evening that they were going to top out the Manhattan Bank and have a fireworks show, Walter Chrysler and his men turned all the Klieg lights onto the top of the Chrysler building, which is made of what? Aluminum. And what happens when you shine a bright light on aluminum? It's shiny. You suddenly have the biggest Roman candle in the world. And they winched into place, in the period of less than an hour, the spire, which was another 100 feet tall. Not 5, not 10, 100 feet tall. So his building went from 924 feet to 1,047. Those people in New York at the Bank of New York are watching this happen. They are watching their own humiliation from the top of their building. And Walter Chrysler was able to claim the spot of the tallest building in the world, in a building that had his own car details right on the corners. Notice the hubcaps on the left, the eagle, which was his hood ornament. And there it is to show you what it was on a car. Taller than Woolworth, taller than anything, the tallest place on the planet. And the world forgot the Bank of New York, very, very rapidly forgot the Bank of New York, and remembered only the Chrysler building, which appeared on postcards and in advertising and in every kind of writing about New York all around the world, and remains that way. It became the focus of art. It became the focus of all kinds of art. Here's Margaret Burke White stupidly sitting on the very corner of one of those eagles about 65 floors above New York taking pictures of the city. The architect became very famous. That's William Van Allen standing in the middle dressed as his building at the architect's ball in New York that year. Yes, architects do this kind of thing. And everybody wanted their own Chrysler building. So here it is in Dubai, many, many years later. Here it is, Helmut Jahn, your own Helmut Jahn, doing his own Chrysler building in Philadelphia. Even Lego got in on the act, right? You can't have enough Chrysler buildings in the world. It's an extraordinarily beautiful thing. And there is, if you look at it in the New York skyline, though there are many buildings taller than Chrysler, there are no buildings more beautiful than that. There are no buildings more elegant. There are no buildings quite so insouciant on the skyline as this one. And if you pay attention late at night on some evenings, people claim that if you look just closely enough, you can see Walter Chrysler pacing back and forth in his building, looking down upon New York City. But victory, though sweet, is often short-lived. Because before Chrysler was even built, another building started blocks away, just a few blocks away, by an architect no one had ever heard of, Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. It doesn't even sound good. And that building was big, a lot bigger across the base, a lot bigger across the middle, and ultimately a lot taller than the Chrysler building, which you can see over there on the right-hand side in this slide. Yes, it was the Empire State Building, and yes, it was built breathtakingly quickly, so that though it started after the Chrysler building, it finished just almost at the same time. And at 1,250 feet was put the competition to bed. Put the competition to bed. The other thing that put the competition to bed was this building opened, the Chrysler building topped out October 28th, 1929. Really bad timing. Really bad timing for Walter Chrysler. This one opened 1 year later, just barely a year later. Interestingly enough, Walter Chrysler got a little bit of revenge on this, I believe, the greatest skyscraper ever built in New York, and the one that embodies the city more than any other. One that actually reaches up into the sky and grabs moving vehicles by their nose and drags them into its own orbit. A building that not only can defy structural logic and the gods themselves, but can play with just anything around it. So you better be damn careful if you're sailing around the top of the Empire State Building, ladies and gentlemen. But Walter Chrysler got his revenge because his building was 75% leased through the whole depression. This became known as the Empty State Building because it never had more than 25% of it leased until the 1940s. We talk about people, and we talk about monkeys, because the Empire State Building isn't just the biggest building in the world. It beats nature at every level. Not only does it touch the sky, it defeats everything nature can throw at it and what we can throw back. So when you are a person of tremendous wealth and power, and you are reaching up, and you can build, you still can't get rid of the monkeys. So what do we talk about when we talk about architecture? We talk about people, but we talk about places as well. Where is this? Levittown. Oh no, Levittown should only hope to be this big. This is the neighborhood of my childhood. Oh my God. Where is that? Ugh, Phoenix. Yeah, that's a subdivision in Phoenix, Arizona. Horrifying, isn't it? People grow up in that miasma, that placeless place, that endless stream of nowhere. Buildings that they're like, this can't be real when you look at it from the air. This is Del Webb's Sun City. It's in a radial pattern. Things that are so awful from the air that they can only get worse the further out into space you go looking at them. So much so that artists like Michael Moore, not the film director, a different person, can actually buy a piece of land just outside of Phoenix and carve out of crops a subdivision, including streets and house sites, into the landscape. But when you get down on the ground, you find, oh, it's much worse. Because every house is the same. Every house looks exactly the same. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Phoenix or Denver, and I don't even know where this is, because there's no landscape to tell me, and the architecture has nothing to do with anywhere, and mixes all of it up, and they're all the same, and how do you know? You only know because yours is blue, or yellow, or green, or some other shade of beige. Where's this? I don't know. I pulled them off the internet. They were embarrassed to say. They didn't actually want to admit where they were. These are places that live in ignominy all the time. They don't even want you to find them. They're like this. They're like cars. They're just objects that roll off an assembly line into a place of placelessness, as I said, like this. This is the Rockville Pike in Maryland. This could be anywhere. This was shot out of my own rearview mirror. This is one of those places where the rule is the rule of anomie. This is the place where everything looks the same and people's spirits go to die. Does it have to be like that? These people say no. These are Andres Duany and Elizabeth Platter-Zyberg. You heard me mention them before. These are the people that looked out at that landscape, looked out at those streets, that mall, this place, and said, enough, enough. There is an alternative. And that alternative is something that we all knew when we were young. It was a place that felt like something that was familiar about everything, even though it was slightly different, even though it was brand new. It was something you knew, something your mother and father knew, something your grandmother and grandfather knew. The American town with pitched roofs and porches and a beautiful ocean, or in our case, a lake in Chicago. A place that looked kind of like this postcard. Notice the name of the inn that you're looking at, the Seaside Inn in Daytona Beach, Florida, which is not where Seaside actually is. Something that reminded you of your heritage and the place you had been. A picture postcard kind of town. And this is the official postcard of Seaside. So they planned it as architects. They drew the plans. They drew the plans with the large central square where you can see every street either leads you to the boardwalk along the ocean or into the middle of town where you will meet your neighbors. Where all those towns, all those buildings look like things that you've seen before in every picture of every American kind of town. Sorry, I'm trying to go forward here. Clapboard houses. Even shingle style, not this one. Clapboard houses, this one very much like the Mediterranean, the Caribbean. Or this one close to a shingle style. It could be New England or it could be South Florida. But it could be something that you knew. How many of you have seen houses like this? How many of you grew up in a house like this? Or next door to a house like this? With streets that you could walk on. Overshaded by the trees. Pedestrian and bicycle streets. Walking streets between buildings that are very close together. There isn't 8 lanes of traffic between these two. There's no mall. There's no hamburger mat in this town. There's just placid, peaceful people in their placid, peaceful town. And it really is nice. It feels better than those god-awful, hideous suburbs. You can even find streets made of sand in this community. Streets where people leave their children. They're not worried. That kid will be there when he gets back. He's made of fiberglass. Where you have a U.S. post office that looks like a U.S. post office. It doesn't look like some goofy modernist box dropped onto the landscape. A church that's churchish and even has a name on the card, the chapel at Seaside, interdenominational. And it is actually kind of a beautiful building that stretches in a sort of reference to American-style clapboard Gothic, right? You can see all of the clapboard on the side and the tallness of Gothic, and yet the familiarity of almost at the same time a sort of English approach to the top of it. Or a modernized version. They could even a modernized beach pavilion with little sailboats running. It's a place where people come together and they know each other. And it feels different than all those suburbs. And it had a strength in its idea. It had strengths not just in its picturesque qualities, but in the plans that actually very carefully laid out the distance from house to house, where the fronts and the backs were, how far they could come together, and made decisions like this in the central town square where all of the buildings would touch at the edge and along a circle to create an enclosure, a sense of enclosure, rather than just dropping these things down on the site in the way that earned the most income. And the roofscapes, the wonderful picturesque roofscapes, the highs and the lows and the syncopation back and forth between them. That just makes you kind of feel good looking at it. Like you could come there as a tourist. And B, immediately accepted. I hear you laughing already. And yes, it was the place where they filmed The Truman Show. And this is Truman's house, which is one of the noted architects did this house. And they peopled it with the right cars and the right folks. And they imagined in that movie a perfect landscape. And notice the edge of it. That's actually how it used to look. It isn't anymore. Now there are other developments next to it. So that you could live in this perfect city completely enclosed with no end, just the landscape off to the end. But eventually, if you look far enough, you find that in a community like this, it's no more real than the others are. It's just a different conception of how to put it together. Not that it's a bad thing, though Truman chooses to leave at the end. It does present a different kind of vision, but I would put it to you that it is not placeless. It is not placeless. And if Elizabeth Platt-Zyberk and Anders Duani have anything that we have anything to thank them for, it's to remind us that we don't have to live the other way, though many of us do and did live the other way by just accepting that as the only option. It's a bit of an innovation, in a way. And we talk about innovation when we talk about architecture. That's Levittown. So that suburb, those suburban conditions did not come about by accident. After the Second World War, there were millions of Americans ready to move out of the cities and into new kinds of lifestyles. And so the suburb happened. The suburb was an attempt to create a different kind of lifestyle than the dense, dirty urbanism of the then center of most American cities. At a time when the world seemed to be changing in strange and mysterious ways, where people could work at machines that added and subtracted for you, and did all kinds of complications using fancy tape and cards with holes punched in them. And there were these new devices that could broadcast pictures through space with no connection to anything. Utter magic. The stuff of Dick Tracy coming true right before, and I gotta say, I just love this woman, this kittenish woman, holding on to her spaceship-like television controls, selling this vision of the future. Or the actual spaceship. It's a time when people are leaving the planet, not 50 feet or 100 or 1,000 feet, but all the way off the planet, doing things that people had never done before. And some of those things are scary. And so when you talk about change that leads to something like a suburb, you have to actually get behind it and ask, what are the conditions that led to that change? And how do we deal with those changes? And there are architects who step into that void. Does anybody recognize this one? That's Eero Saarinen, correct. Young Eero Saarinen, in his late 30s. An architect whose very job was to remake the world. He saw that as his job, to remake the world. And so when Saarinen was asked, who grew up here at Cranbrook, this was a building that he designed there with his father. That's the Cranbrook Art Museum and the Peristyle. When he was asked to think about the world, he thought about it differently. This is a grade school. This is a primary school in Wisconsin. Now, I just want to point out to you that a primary school student is the size of that fire extinguisher. That fire hydrant, sorry. That's the size of a kid going to that school. Look at that. I'm sure that if you had been a 7-year-old, you would have had the same response when you got there every day. Oh, shit. I have to behave. I better pay attention. I better sit up straight. School is all about telling you what you are going to do and how you're going to do it every minute of every day, and God help you if you are let loose in that place without guidance. And Saarinen said, you know, there might be another way. And right here in Chicago, Illinois, he proposed another way. Correct. Crow Island Elementary School. Now, do you see actual children there in the front porch? Yes. And do you notice they're actually half the height almost, or a third of the height of the building? Saarinen's principal idea in this building is that children are people too. It was a radical idea at its time, that children were people. And I don't want to give all the credit to Saarinen. This was also a crusading grade school principal and school district superintendent that were progressive educators and who asked him to give a vision to the idea that children were people, and so he did, and created a plan that had never been used for a school before, that went horizontally instead of vertically. Why? To tie the school into the landscape, to make the school a part of the nature around it. Look at that school reach out and grab that driveway. Do you see that? Look at those fingers out into the landscape. Do you see every classroom is fingering its way out into the landscape? It's so when they actually build the classrooms, the children can look out and see that landscape. They can see green. They can see a verdant environment that reminds them of the places that they play, that they're never far away from that. And it's okay to see that. Notice the furniture. Is it bolted down? No. Is it big? No. All custom made by the architect for the kids. Now, this is a school that went from first grade to 8th grade. And in every year that you went through the school, the furniture in your classroom got a little bigger, room by room. And when you go to the auditorium in this school, the lowest rows are where the smallest children sat, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade. And as you get to the back of the auditorium, the seats are bigger. Even in the auditorium, every detail. And look at this room. What's the biggest thing? The quality of light, the daylight, the windows. They're enormous. They're the whole wall. The Saarinens believed that daylight made you healthy. Shocking, because they weren't scientists. But what have we discovered? Oh, daylight makes you healthy. So they actually rethought how schools worked. And the children at this school are studied for decades. And guess what? They perform better than school children everywhere. Now, interestingly enough, working for the Saarinens on this project were 2 local architects, Philip Will and Perkins. Bradford Perkins?
Dwight.
Is that what it was? Perkins. And they started Perkins and Will on the back of this project. And what did Perkins and Will do first? Schools all across the United States. They became the premier designers of schools. And what did they do? They replicated and continued to perfect this model that they had worked out together with the Saarinens. Office towers. Mies van der Rohe, very busy reinventing the office tower in the United States when he comes here to Chicago. Eero Saarinen looking at the office tower and saying, wow, that's beautiful and very inefficient. Why? Look at all those columns. Look at all those columns. What does that mean? That means every time you want to plan, you got to plan around the columns, right? They're never going to move. The elevator cores, you can't get rid of that, right? That has to be there. And Mies's plan is to drag them as far backwards as you can get them, right? To get them out of the way of the planning module of the building. Saarinen says, well, CBS is going to hire me to do their headquarters. So I'll do them a headquarters, and that's it. You see it right there on 6th Avenue in New York. Very elegant, very tall looking because the structural elements on the outside run uninterrupted all the way to the top. And the glass is pulled very far back, so far back that it becomes a shadow, nothing but a shadow. So this building is simply a study in vertical massing and a beautiful race to the sky, a beautiful, beautiful visual race to the sky. But that's hiding the really important part. There it is up close. That's hiding the really important part. Here's a plan of the building. What's missing? No columns. Why? They're all along the perimeter, All that visual race is made by structural members that are at the perimeter of the building. And so that whole space is completely flexible and can take any kind of plan you want. So here he is redesigning something that had just been invented and doing it all over again right across town. Everybody know this building? This is the Ford Foundation, exactly. Now, Arrow didn't live to see this building finished, but he did sketch the original drawings. And changes office buildings forever. It's not a tall building. It's only about 10 stories tall, 12 stories tall. But what he does with it, you see all that glass on the perimeter? Watch this. It's a garden in the city. He makes a park. He makes a public park inside the building. And the difference between a public park in and out is what? Quiet. This is a place of contemplation, relaxation, how to get out of the hubbub and the busyness of the city. And this is New York City, all around you. This is a place you can go and calmly call your own and look down wherever your office is at greenery all year long. It's the first ever building to have its own internal garden. So he's not done. And there he is again, working on a piece of furniture with his Cranbrook schoolmate, a woman at Cranbrook named Florence Schust. She ran off with a German furniture manufacturer named Hans Knoll. They got married, and she becomes Florence Knoll, the most important person in all of the 20th century in contemporary design and furniture and the marketing of that furniture. And they're working on this. Maybe the most beautiful set of tables and chairs ever designed in the 20th century. Look at how thin the vertical is on the small coffee table. It's as if it can't possibly get any thinner. It's just a little spider's hair of thickness there. And what's the other difference between this table and all other tables?
No legs.
That's right, one leg. One leg. It did what Saarinen referred to as removing the slum of legs beneath a chair and a table. And this catches fire in the public imagination in incredible ways. So here you are on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise. In the 23rd century, that chair is still working right there on the Enterprise. All you got to do is put a little pad over the top to disguise that it's the actual Saarinen chair. And of course, they added a little feet to the legs. But that's it, flying through the galaxy. Or his famous womb chair. My favorite Arrow Saarinen problem, second favorite, sorry, I'm going to show you the favorite in a minute, is how do you solve the problem of building the world's tallest arch and put the last piece in? Right? This is not a small problem because they built it from the outside, from each of the outside to the center, leaving only the keystone. And that little thing you see hanging at the about 1/3 of the way is the keystone being jacked up and dropped into place. They were only off on the building by 1/52nd, I think, I have to look that number up, of an inch. So it dropped beautifully into place. And then they were able to let those two horizontal structural members go, and it fell into place and became the world's largest hanging catenary arch. And the most beautiful piece of public sculpture probably ever done anywhere, but certainly ever done in the United States. So he too got to be on the cover of Time magazine. This is Time magazine lecture. And I think that it really hits its stride with this, when Arrow is asked to design the first airport for jet travel. In New York, TWA terminal, look at that building. It sort of looks like it could be an eagle, doesn't it? But it just could be a building. It just could be a beautiful piece of sculpture. And it might not surprise you to know that Arrow Saarinen was first a sculptor. Inside this fantastic buzzing beehive of stairs going every direction and pieces of information being flashed up on space-age kinds of screens. This is the late 1950s, where everybody's in motion somewhere in ways that they've never been in motion before. And the softness and the smoothness of all of the edges, taking away that hard right-angle rectangular world that we lived in. And all of this design, there's Arrow and his designers, without computers. This is all done by model and by hand as they're rushing off to the future, rushing down those tunnels to their future, to a jet-driven future of no restraints, no controls, of lifting you up and out and into the world. Now, I want to stay for just one moment that Eero Saarinen only lived to see 2 of these buildings built. He got his office started when he inherited from his father in 1951 at the age of 41. And he designed all of the buildings you just saw and 20 more in 10 years and died at the age of 51 from surgery to remove a tumor on his brain. Finally, we talk like that of Eero, that kind of thing. We're talking about inspiration. And the last thing we're going to talk about tonight, when we talk about architecture, we talk about inspiration. This is Hale County, Alabama, one of the poorest places in America. A place that is devoid of almost any of the benefits of major urban life, because there is none, and most of the economic benefits of living in an advanced state. These photographs are less than 1 year old of Hale County. It's a place where truly, if you blink in Greensboro, the biggest city in Hale County, you're looking at it now, you will pass through the town. A place of rampant and tireless and endless poverty. A rural economy which no longer can really produce in a way that is able to support the people there in a meaningful fashion, leaving them living like this. Until that man came along. This is the guy with the beard. That's Sam Mockbee. And Sam Mockbee was an architect, a very successful, high-end design architect with a firm called Mockbee Coker that was just winning every design prize in the world when they were practicing. And he was a teacher at Auburn. And he went to Hale County. He's from Mississippi. He'd lived in the rural, poverty-stricken South. And he wanted to be able to do something about it. And so he came up with the idea that he would take a group of students, you see them there on the right, and they would go to Hale County, and they would talk to people in that town about what they needed, what was missing, how life could be better. And they would work with them to do that. And the students would design buildings for them, and then they would build them. So you had a double benefit. You had the people getting a better life, and you had the students learning how to make buildings, because after all, they were going to architecture school. It's something allegedly architecture schools do, allegedly. And so they built buildings that looked a lot different than the rest of Hale County, that used materials differently, all kinds of materials, and we'll see that in just a moment, such as this building, which is using river stones, the little shed on the right, and the top building, the house, which is using polyvinyl. It's a plastic material, a sheeting material that's basically used in factories. This house, which uses leftover bits of container shipping metal. My favorite, the Love House, and that's Mrs. Love there. Hers is made of carpet. Those are carpet tiles stacked up. This is a church, a chapel, made of windshields removed from wrecked automobiles. There it is on the inside. It's a beautiful little chapel, isn't it? Isn't that a grand space? This is another chapel made out of automobile tires coated in mud. And they improved the lives of the people in this county. And this program has been going on for 20 years and has built dozens of buildings all around and has helped these people create a real community for themselves rather than living in the clutches of poverty. Do they make money from this? No. They don't charge any money. The people whose houses they're building, they give them to them. The students are working for academic credit. They're not allowed to get paid. It's all underwritten by donations. And this is the latest. They just finished this last year, very sophisticated. Sam Mockbee, unfortunately, did not live to see this. He died about 10 years ago. So, What do we talk about when we talk about architecture? We talk about the built forms of our cultural ambition. We talk about ourselves as people. We talk about how we organize ourselves as people. We talk about the places in which we live. We talk about the innovations that allow us to live the way we want. And we talk about the inspirational people who bring us there. And we talk about buildings like this that wrap all of that into one smooth, simple package. One building that just makes you want to actually shed tears, because it's one of those times where human beings actually stand up to nature and are able to improve it. It is not often that a human can go toe-to-toe with nature. But if you have the right ambition, you can. You can touch the sky. You can reach up and place yourself in an environment that you were not in before. You do not have to let no be the answer when someone tells you you want to do something different. You want to be 1,400 feet in the air. You can do that. You can build images of your history that project using a language that's thousands of years old, that project messages about what you want to be in the world. Why choose a Greco-Roman historic language for the US Capitol? Because the Greeks and the Romans invented our form of government years ago. And the Romans, our form of engineering and our form of domination. But these are messages that go out and ring true hundreds of years after they're completed. Or modern versions of the same thing that talk about the stresses and the turbulences, but also the wonderful beauties of a world where everything is just not quite sure or certain. Or here in Chicago, the simple elegance of a building that's almost not there. A building that's just barely what you need to protect you from the weather and the elements, to give you shelter, to stand on little feet above that landscape so you're barely intruding into it. A building that gives you that sense of quiet calm that puts you at ease in your world. Thank you. Thank you. So, that's what we talk about when we talk about architecture. And would anybody like to ask questions? Oh, yes, the answer is yes. Okay, we're going to go 1, 2, 3. That's how I got them.
What was the first year? Just repeat.
So let's see if we can get you a mic. Can you hang on 1 second? So because we're recording all this.
What was the first year that Vincent Scully taught at Yale?
1948. Vincent Scully taught at Yale starting in 1948, I think. It may have been 47, but I think it's 48. Sorry, you were next, yes. And then Robert.
Were the rug house and the mud house feasible?
Were they leasable?
Feasible.
Feasible, yeah, they're built. The people living in them.
Rug?
Yeah, rugs. Rugs. Compressed carpet tiles.
Okay.
Yep. They're completely watertight. Carpet, everybody knows what a carpet tile is, right? So the backing of a carpet tile is generally rubber or vinyl or something like that, and that's a weather-intensive thing. When you smash them that flat and with that much weight, the carpet actually absorbs water into it only so far, and then it just wicks right back out.
What about the mud?
What about the mud?
The mud house.
The mud house is, there's many old mud construction techniques. For instance, all over the southwestern US, Adobe. Adobe does just fine in water because it sets up really hard. And ultimately, you have to reapply the mud about every couple hundred years. So am I still on the mic? No? Yes. Okay, Rob next, and then right back here.
What disturbed you and distressed you about that first day in Vincent Scully's class?
What disturbed me about the first day in Vincent Scully's class? Well, if you have to know, he was talking about a building that was lifting and thrusting into space, thrusting with a sexual energy, unlike anything in history before it. And I'm like, whoa, sexual energy in a building. I was 19. Sex was not a word I had said out loud, and certainly not in a classroom, and certainly not with a building that went like that at the top. The Wiesenhof, not the Wiesenhof Siedlungen, the workers' housing in,
Weishaupt in Germany.
Yes, it's in Germany.
1927, 20.
That one, with those stair towers that do this. And it was a little too much for my South Texas ears. So I went home and thought about other things. Question? Not for long, though. I got over that.
Did you assemble that collection of pictures by yourself?
This?
That whole collection?
Yes.
Because I must say, it's a fantastic collection.
Thank you.
And it completes a story very nicely.
Thank you. Thank you. We have to say thank you to the internet. As someone who taught architecture for about 10 years, I taught a big lecture class at a time with no internet. And so to assemble those pictures meant going to the slide library for about a week and pulling individual slides and dropping them into little trays like that. Well, turning them upside down and dropping them into little trays. Oh, what a way to waste your youth. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Oh, it's just a comment. I believe they had to hose down St. Louis Arch because it was a very hot day.
Yes, that's correct.
So it didn't quite.
That's correct. It had heated and expanded, and they had to actually pour cold water on it to bring it back. It's a great story.
That was a beautiful movie in the exhibition.
Correct. In the Saarinen exhibition, you can find this on YouTube. You can watch the video. It's called Arrow Saarinen Invents the Future, I believe. And it shows that whole thing, and you can see water just pouring off this building. But it was pretty great. The design was correct. They didn't know it was going to be that hot that day.
It was an
So,
incredible moment.
amazing, amazing. And the video actually shows this thing going into place, and you're like, oh my God, it's not going to fit. Release the hinges, boom, then it fits forever. Anything else? Yeah, way in the back.
Did your mother forgive you?
Never. Are you kidding? She was waiting for Kroloff, 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 and Kroloff. I have 3 brothers, all 3 of them. What are they?
Architect.
No, please, no. Architects. Not doctors. What's next? Lawyers, exactly. 3 lawyers and it. Yes, they forgave me. I'll tell you when they forgave me. When they saw me on television. Then it was all good. It was all good. Oh, that's our son Reed. Yeah, the one on television, yeah. Yeah. Yes.
What are some of your favorite buildings in Chicago and why?
Well, first of all, I want you to know that I moved to Chicago 18 months ago. And I moved to Chicago 18 months ago by choice, not to take a job. My partner and I were at a point in our lives where we had the opportunity to move somewhere rather than follow a job option. And we did a search of cities across the US, and Chicago won. Handily. Handily. And my partner does not function below 65 degrees. So this tells you how strong Chicago was. And we chose Chicago for several reasons. First of all, the clarity of your political system. That was the immediate one. After that, we wanted a city with great culture. We found it. We wanted a city with great food. Ooh, well, we found that too. And we lived in New Orleans, so trust me, it's a fight to the death on that one. And third, we wanted a city where architecture mattered. And this is a city where architecture matters. And my favorite buildings, I wake up, I live. I cannot believe that I am able to tell you this. I live on the top floor of 910 North Lakeshore Drive. I live in Mies heaven, right? And when you're someone trained in architecture, that is as far up as you go. right? Unless you are like me and you're with your real estate agent and you're looking at all these apartments and she keeps showing you this lake over and over again. And I keep saying to her, I don't care about water. I want the buildings. And so she takes me across the hall and to what is now my bedroom, where I don't open the curtains, I sleep with them open. And then right in front of me, all day and all night, is Big John. And that building is so beautiful and so perfect and so strong and so American. It wears its structure on its sleeve, and it just dominates everything around it and does not actually care what's near it. It's just there making a presence. I like that. I really, really like that. I like seeing it every morning. It does make me think about Vincent Scully and his, but it's just a moment of tremendous pleasure every day. I cannot tell you, I have only been that happy living at Cranbrook, where I woke up and saw that fountain. That picture was taken from my living room. Or when I lived in Carl Millis' sculptures, or when I lived, I also got to live in a Saarinen building at Yale when I was there. And that kind of thing is just fantastic. So Sears, I don't care what they call it now, Sears is fantastic. There's so much. I was by the Monadnock building this weekend. I was out for a walk. The mighty Monadnock, as Scully used to call it. Little tiny building, barely that big. 16-foot thick walls. I mean, just, amazing. Every corner you turn, there's something else. This is a magic place for architecture.
Is it too late for me to become an architect?
Never. That's a perfect way to end the evening. It's never too late to be an architect. Thank you very much.